The cold metal band around her finger felt like a shackle forged in nightmare. Evelyn's eyes snapped open to the echo of whispered voices and the dying chime of ancient bells, her heart hammering against ribs that ached with each desperate breath. This wasn't the cramped bus seat where exhaustion had finally claimed her after 16 hours of stitching wedding gowns for women who would never know her name. This was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that smelled of centuries-old stone and melted candle wax, somewhere that made her skin crawl with the certainty that her life had just been stolen while she slept. The great hall stretched before her like a cathedral built for shadows, its vaulted ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to breathe. Massive stone pillars rose like ancient guardians, their surfaces carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Tall candles flickered in iron sconces, their flames dancing to some unfelt wind, casting writhing shadows that made the velvet curtains appear to move with malevolent life. But it was the stained glass windows that made her stomach lurch with terror, their deep blue lights spilling across the floor like spilled blood, cold and unnatural in the pre-dawn darkness. "The ceremony has been concluded according to the ancient law," announced a voice that might have belonged to death itself. The butler emerged from the shadows like something summoned from her worst dreams, his pale face gaunt with centuries of secrets, his black formal wear pristine as a funeral shroud. By falling into sleep under the protection of a clan host during the midnight toll, the pact has been recognized and sealed. Evelyn tried to speak, but her throat felt raw, scraped hollow by the scream she must have swallowed in her sleep. The ring on her finger pulsed with a warmth that felt obscene against her frozen skin, and when she lifted her wrist, silver lines glowed beneath the surface like veins filled with moonlight. The mark of binding, permanent as a scar, beautiful as a wound that would never heal. Around her, figures in dark velvet and midnight silk dispersed with respectful nods and hungry eyes that devoured the scandal of her presence. Vampires, her mind whispered with the clarity of pure terror. Every childhood story her grandmother had warned her about, every nightmare that had ever made her check the locks twice, every instinct that screamed at her to run from dark places and beautiful strangers. They moved with fluid grace that mocked human limitations, their pale faces turned toward her with the fascination of predators discovering fresh prey had wandered into their domain. But it was the figure at the center of the hall who made her forget how to breathe. He stood motionless as carved marble, tall and lean, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. His skin held the pallor of someone who had never felt true sunlight. But it was his eyes that trapped her, dark as winter nights and just as merciless, beautiful in the way that deadly things were beautiful, terrible in the way that power was terrible when it recognized no equal. Lord Darius Ravencrest, her mind supplied with devastating clarity, though she had never heard the name before this moment. Vampire Lord of the Shadow Peaks, master of the ancient clan that ruled these mountain territories with laws older than memory. The man who had somehow become her husband while she slept, exhausted and defenseless, on a bus that should have carried her safely home. "This cannot be real," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast space. "This is impossible." The Lord's eyes found hers across the distance, and she felt the impact like a physical blow. There was no cruelty in his gaze, but there was something far worse, an acceptance of what had been done that spoke of power so absolute it need never justify itself. When he moved, it was with the fluid grace of water over stone, closing the space between them until she could smell the scent that had haunted her final moments of consciousness. Warm spices and ancient wood that spoke of forests older than civilization. "The law recognizes no impossibility," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Only fulfillment of ancient covenant. You slept under my protection during the sacred hour. The bells witnessed. The clan witnessed. The binding is complete. "I didn't consent to this," Evelyn managed, her hands shaking as she tried to work the ring from her finger. It wouldn't move, wouldn't even shift, as if it had grown from her very bone. "I was just trying to get home. I work 2 jobs to support my family. I can't just disappear into some fairy tale nightmare." Something flickered in his dark eyes, too quick to interpret. "The law requires no consent, only circumstance. But neither does it require cruelty." He gestured to the butler, who approached with the measured steps of a funeral procession. "Magnus will show you to your chambers. The household will explain the rules that govern this place, the protections and obligations that now bind us both." Protections? The word came out as a bitter laugh. "You've kidnapped me into some medieval ritual, and you speak of protection. Look around you," Lord Darius said quietly. "See the clan members departing, the ceremony concluded, the ancient forms observed. In 3 days' time, Lady Cordelia Blackthorne will arrive to claim tribute from this village, as she has done for 20 years. Without a lady of the castle to receive her as equal, she would have taken what she pleased. Children for her amusement, young men for her games, women for her experiments." His voice never rose, but each word fell like a stone into still water. "The law I invoke tonight will protect them all." Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her feet, reality reorganizing itself around truths too large to process. "You used me. I saved them," he replied. "And in doing so, perhaps saved you as well, though I suspect you would prefer the danger you knew to the protection you have found." The butler cleared his throat with the delicacy of one accustomed to interrupting moments that could shatter like glass. "My lady, if you would permit me to escort you. The household is prepared for your comfort, and there are matters of protocol that must be explained before dawn." Evelyn looked around the great hall one more time, taking in the impossible grandeur, the watching shadows, the cold beauty of a world she had never imagined existed. The mark on her wrist pulsed steadily, like a heartbeat that belonged to someone else, and she realized with crystalline clarity that her old life had ended the moment she closed her eyes on that mountain bus. Whether what came next would be salvation or damnation remained to be seen. "The ring," she said, holding up her bound hand. "How do I remove it?" Lord Darius studied her with those unreadable dark eyes. "There are 3 proofs that must be fulfilled to dissolve the ancient binding. An ancestral song played before witnesses, the return of a family token given in trust, and a public act that reverses any humiliation suffered by either spouse." He paused, and for the first time his perfect composure seemed to crack just slightly. "The governess will explain the details, should you choose to pursue them." "Choose?" Evelyn's voice rose with the first spark of hope she had felt since waking. "You're saying I can undo this?" "I am saying the law provides for all possibilities," he replied carefully. "Though I would counsel you to understand fully what you would be choosing between before you decide." The butler's gentle insistence finally moved her from the spot where she had stood frozen, and as she followed him across the stone floor, she heard the Lord's voice one more time, so quiet she might have imagined it. "Welcome to Ravencrest Castle, Lady Evelyn. I pray you will find more here than you have lost." The corridors beyond the great hall stretched like arteries through the castle's stone body, lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on walls, hung with tapestries older than memory. Magnus, the butler, moved with the silent efficiency of someone who had served this house for decades, possibly centuries, his formal manner a thin veneer over something that might have been sympathy. "The family has ruled these territories for 700 years, he explained, as they climbed a curved stairway that seemed to wind upward forever. "Lord Darius is the 13th of his line, and perhaps the most conscientious in his duties to both clan and village. The binding you have entered serves purposes beyond your immediate understanding." Evelyn's legs ached with exhaustion, but her mind raced with questions that multiplied faster than she could ask them. "The woman he mentioned, Lady Blackthorne, What kind of tribute does she demand? Magnus paused at a landing decorated with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to track their movement. Lady Cordelia has ruled the Eastern Territories since before your grandmother was born. She maintains her youth and power through methods that civilized minds prefer not to examine too closely. Every 20 years, she tours the villages under her influence, selecting those who please her for various purposes. She has not been refused in living memory. Until now, he agreed. The presence of a lady of equal standing in this castle changes the balance of power considerably. You outrank her in precedence as the wife of an older bloodline. She cannot simply take what she wishes from under your protection. They reached a door carved with the same strange symbols she had seen in the Great Hall, and Magnus produced an ornate key from somewhere within his impeccable jacket. Your chambers, my lady. I trust you will find them acceptable. The room beyond was larger than her entire apartment back home, furnished with antiques that belonged in museums. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, casting warm light over silk hangings and furniture that spoke of comfort designed to last centuries rather than years. But it was the windows that drew her attention. Tall casements that looked out over mountain peaks painted silver by moonlight, beautiful and alien as the surface of some distant world. The household rises at sunset, Magnus continued, setting the key on a polished table that probably cost more than she earned in a year. Breakfast is served in the small dining room at 7. Mrs. Whitmore, the governess, will call upon you at 8 to discuss the protocols of your position. Lord Darius requests the honor of your company for dinner at 9, though he will understand if you require additional time to adjust to your circumstances. And if I refuse, if I demand to be taken back to where you found me. Magnus regarded her with pale eyes that held depths she couldn't fathom. Then you would find yourself alone on a mountain road in the hour before dawn, my lady. The village is 12 miles distant, the nearest city 40. The mountain paths are treacherous in darkness, and there are things that hunt in these forests that make our clan seem gentle as lambs. He moved toward the door, then paused. But more than that, you would be abandoning those people to Lady Cordelia's mercies. Whatever you may think of the means that brought you here, the protection you now embody is real. Alone in the sumptuous room, Evelyn sank into a chair that embraced her with the softness of a cloud, and for the first time since awakening, allowed herself to truly feel the magnitude of what had happened. The ring on her finger caught the firelight, its surface inscribed with patterns that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The mark on her wrist had faded to a subtle silver tracery, but she could feel it humming with some internal energy that spoke of permanence. She thought of her mother, waiting for her return with the week's wages that would keep their small household afloat another month. Of her younger brother, who dreamed of university and worked nights at the bakery to save for tuition he might never afford. Of her sister, married too young to escape their father's debts, now raising 3 children on a farm that produced more worry than profit. They would think she had simply vanished, another casualty of the dangerous mountain roads and the unforgiving economy that forced people to travel alone in the dark. But beneath the grief for her lost life, something else stirred. The exhaustion that had plagued her for years was gone, replaced by a strange energy that felt like possibility. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't calculating the cost of every meal, every piece of clothing, every moment not spent earning money. The luxury surrounding her was overwhelming, but it was also seductive in a way that made her ashamed of her own relief. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts, and Mrs. Whitmore entered without waiting for permission, carrying a silver tray laden with foods that made Evelyn's empty stomach clench with hunger. The governess was a woman of perhaps 50, though in this place of ageless vampires, appearances meant nothing. Her graying hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes held a warmth that spoke of someone who had seen too much sorrow to judge others harshly. "You must eat," she said simply, setting the tray on the table beside Evelyn's chair. "The binding draws energy from your body until it stabilizes. Starving yourself will only make the adjustment more difficult." The food was unlike anything from Evelyn's simple world. Delicate pastries filled with cream and berries, sliced meats that melted on her tongue, cheeses aged to perfection and served with honey that tasted of mountain wildflowers. She ate with the desperation of someone who had forgotten when she last had a meal that wasn't calculated to the last penny. And Mrs. Whitmore watched with the satisfaction of a mother seeing her child properly fed. "Lord Darius is not what you expected," the governess observed, when Evelyn's desperate hunger had been satisfied. "I didn't expect any of this," Evelyn replied, gesturing at the opulent room, the impossible situation, the silver lines still glowing faintly on her skin. "Vampires were stories my grandmother told to make me afraid of the dark. Now I'm apparently married to their king and expected to protect a village I've never seen from a woman who collects people like trophies." Mrs. Whitmore settled into the chair across from her, with the careful movements of someone whose joints remembered decades of hard labor before finding sanctuary in this place. 23 years ago, I arrived at this castle much as you did tonight, not through the binding ritual, but fleeing a husband who believed his fists could teach me obedience. I was pregnant, terrified, and convinced that I would die before seeing my child born. She smoothed her dark skirts with hands that bore the permanent calluses of someone who had known real work. Lord Darius's father was master then, and he could have turned me away or worse. Instead, he offered me sanctuary and purpose. My daughter grew up in these halls, educated alongside the young lord, and now serves as magistrate in the village below. "And you've been happy here?" "Happiness is a luxury few women of our station ever truly know," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "But I have been safe, useful, and treated with respect. The vampires of this house are bound by an elixir that tempers their hunger, and by codes of honor that make them more civilized than many humans I have known." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The young lord has never taken a wife because he believes it would be unfair to bind someone to this life without choice. What happened tonight was necessity, not desire. But I have watched him these past hours, and I believe he is already regretting the method, even as he stands by its results." Evelyn felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "The 3 proofs he mentioned, are they real?" "As real as the binding itself," Mrs. Whitmore confirmed, "though I would counsel you to understand the full cost before you choose that path. To dissolve the marriage would leave the village vulnerable again, and Lady Cordelia is not known for her patience with those who thwart her will. She would make examples that would be spoken of in whispers for generations. So I'm trapped either way. Stay and accept this false marriage, or leave and condemn innocent people to suffer for my choice. You are bound by circumstance to make a choice between equally flawed options," the governess corrected gently. "But that does not make you powerless. The law that created this situation also provides for its modification. A binding entered without consent can be transformed into one entered by choice, if both parties agree and the proper forms are observed." Something in her tone suggested knowledge held back, and Evelyn felt her exhaustion lift enough to focus clearly. "There's more, isn't there? Something you're not telling me?" Mrs. Whitmore smiled for the first time since entering the room. "You have an intelligent mind to go with your brave heart. Yes, there is more, but it is not my place to speak of it. That conversation must be between you and Lord Darius when you are ready to hear truths that may change your understanding of everything." She rose from her chair with the same careful precision she had used to sit. "For now, you need rest. Tomorrow evening, you will begin to learn what it means to be Lady of Ravencrest Castle. The village celebrates Harvest Festival in 1 month, and they will expect to meet the woman who now stands as their protector." After the governess left, Evelyn found herself alone, with thoughts too large for her weary mind to contain. She explored the chamber's luxurious appointments, discovering a bathroom with modern plumbing cleverly integrated into medieval stonework, wardrobes filled with clothing in her exact size, and books written in languages she couldn't identify. Everything spoke of preparation, as if someone had known she was coming long before that fateful bus ride through the mountains. The bed, when she finally surrendered to exhaustion, was soft as a cloud and warm as an embrace. But sleep brought dreams of silver chains and ancient songs, of a village she had never seen filled with faces that turned to her with desperate hope, and of dark eyes that held secrets old as the mountains themselves. In her dreams, she walked through forests where the trees whispered her name, and when she woke, she could not shake the feeling that somewhere in those whispered words lay the key to understanding what she had truly become. The mark on her wrist pulsed once, gentle as a heartbeat, and Evelyn realized that whether she chose to stay or flee, to accept or resist, her fate was now intertwined with forces beyond her comprehension. But perhaps, in a world where ancient laws could steal a life in a moment of vulnerability, they could also offer opportunities for a different kind of power than she had ever imagined possible. Dawn was breaking over the mountain peaks when she finally closed her eyes again, and her last conscious thought was a question that would shape everything that came after. What if the cage she had awakened in was actually the key to a freedom she had never dared to dream of? The first month of her new existence passed like a fever dream wrapped in velvet chains. Evelyn learned to navigate the castle's ancient rhythms, rising at sunset to join a household that moved through their nocturnal routines with the precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. The vampires of Clan Ravencrest were nothing like the monsters of folklore, their hunger controlled by the ruby elixir that Magnus prepared each evening with the devotion of a priest conducting mass. She watched him work in the castle's laboratory, a chamber carved from living rock where copper distillation equipment gleamed like ancient altars. Pomegranate seeds crushed until their juice ran red as blood, mountain honey thick as amber, and bitter roots that grew only in the deepest shadows of the forest. The process took 3 hours of careful heating and cooling, each step timed to match the phases of the moon visible through the laboratory's crystal dome. The recipe has been refined over centuries, Magnus explained, as he strained the final product through silk cloth. Without it, our kind would be driven to hunt, to take what they needed from the living. With it, we can coexist, civilized beings bound by choice rather than compulsion. Evelyn found herself drawn to the process, her mind cataloging each ingredient and technique with the instinctive precision of someone who had spent years managing household economies down to the last copper coin. The honey comes from the mountain apiaries, from the Thornfield family, who have supplied our needs for 6 generations. But Lady Cordelia's influence grows stronger each year. She has been purchasing debts throughout the valley, using economic pressure to control the suppliers we depend upon. Magnus sealed the precious elixir in crystal vials, each one containing enough to sustain a vampire for 3 days. If she succeeds in cutting off our sources, the clan would be forced to alternative methods of survival. The implication hung in the air like incense, heavy with threat and possibility. Evelyn understood economics, understood the way debt could be wielded as surely as any sword. What if there were other sources, other suppliers? Magnus regarded her with pale eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Such arrangements would require trust, my lady. Trust that can only be built through time and demonstrated good faith. The villagers have reason to be cautious of promises made by those who live behind castle walls. That evening, Evelyn requested permission to visit the village that now fell under her protection. Lord Darius received her petition in his study, a circular chamber lined with books so old their leather bindings had taken on the texture of human skin. He looked up from correspondence written in flowing script, and she noticed for the first time the exhaustion that shadowed his dark eyes. "The village is 12 miles down the mountain path," he said carefully. "The journey requires daylight hours, which means you would travel alone, without clan protection." "I've been alone most of my life," Evelyn replied. "I think I can manage 12 miles of mountain road." Something flickered across his aristocratic features, too quick to interpret. "That is not what concerns me. Your presence here has already reached Lady Cordelia's ears. She has agents throughout the valley, and a young woman traveling without escort would present an irresistible opportunity for mischief. Then send an escort. Any member of my clan would be weakened by prolonged sunlight exposure. They would be protection in name only, and a liability in truth." He set down his pen with the precise movements of someone accustomed to controlling every gesture. "If you insist on this course, I would suggest waiting until after the harvest festival, when the political situation has stabilized." Evelyn felt the familiar fire that had sustained her through years of impossible choices and grinding poverty. "The political situation will never stabilize if I remain hidden in this castle like some fairy tale princess. These people need to know who I am, what I stand for, if they're going to trust me to protect them." Lord Darius studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. "And what do you stand for, Lady Evelyn?" The question caught her off guard, forcing her to examine motivations she had barely acknowledged to herself. "I stand for earning what I have through my own efforts, for protecting those who cannot protect themselves, for finding solutions that don't require anyone to sacrifice their dignity or their children's future." She met his dark gaze without flinching. "I will not be a decoration in this castle while innocent people suffer because of decisions made without their knowledge or consent." For a long moment, the only sound in the study was the soft whisper of wind through ancient stone. Then Lord Darius smiled, an expression so unexpected and transformative that Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat. "Very well," he said, "but you will not go alone. Marcus Thornfield, the apothecary's apprentice, often travels between village and castle on business. He knows the mountain paths and can serve as both guide and witness to your intentions." 3 days later, Evelyn found herself riding pillion behind a young man whose knowledge of mountain herbs rivaled that of any university scholar. Marcus Thornfield was perhaps 25, with the weathered hands of someone who worked outdoors and the quick intelligence of someone who had educated himself through observation and experimentation. His family's apiary produced the honey essential to the clan's elixir, making him one of the few villagers who regularly interacted with the castle's inhabitants. "The honey harvest has been poor this year," he explained, as their horse picked its way down the narrow mountain path. "Lady Cordelia's agents have been spreading rumors about disease among the hives, driving down prices and making the smaller producers desperate enough to accept her loans." Loans with what terms? Exclusive supply contracts, binding the producers to sell only to her designated buyers. Within 2 years, she could control every source of honey in the valley. His voice carried the frustrated anger of someone who understood the trap being laid, but lacked the power to prevent it. "My family has refused her offers so far, but the pressure grows stronger each month." The village of Millbrook, nestled in a valley carved by centuries of mountain streams, its stone houses clustering around a central square where the weekly market sprawled beneath colorful awnings. The scent of fresh bread mingled with herbs and flowers, while the sound of children's laughter provided counterpoint to the rhythmic clacking of weaving looms. It was beautiful in the way that places shaped by generations of human care could be beautiful. Every stone and garden path, speaking of lives lived with purpose and pride. But Evelyn's trained eye also noticed the signs of economic pressure that Marcus had described. Too many stalls stood empty in the market square. Too many of the houses showed the telltale signs of deferred maintenance that spoke of families choosing between roof repairs and food. The clothing worn by the villagers was clean but patched, cared for with the desperate attention of people who could not afford to replace what they had. Marcus led her to the inn that served as the village's unofficial meeting place, where news was shared over ale and decisions that affected the entire community were debated by firelight. The innkeeper, a formidable woman named Sarah Blackwood, looked Evelyn up and down with the frank assessment of someone accustomed to measuring character at a glance. "So you're the new lady of the castle," she said without preamble. "The one who supposedly married our Lord Darius in the middle of the night without so much as a by your leave." "I am Lady Evelyn Ravencrest," Evelyn replied, matching the woman's directness with her own. "Though I'll admit the circumstances of my marriage were unconventional." Sarah snorted with what might have been amusement. "Unconventional is one word for it. Another would be scandalous, or perhaps convenient, given Lady Cordelia's planned visit." She gestured for them to sit at a table near the great fireplace, where the warmth could chase away the mountain chill. "The question that matters is what you intend to do about the problems facing this village." Over the next 2 hours, Evelyn listened to a catalogue of woes that painted a picture of systematic economic warfare. Lady Cordelia's agents had been active throughout the valley, offering loans to struggling families, purchasing debts from local merchants, and gradually tightening a web of financial obligation that would culminate in her harvest festival visit. Families who had farmed these lands for generations now faced the choice between accepting her protection or watching their children go hungry through the coming winter. "She's been particularly interested in the young people," added Thomas Millwright, whose family had operated the village's grain mill for 4 generations, offering positions in her eastern territories, promising education and opportunity for those willing to enter her service. "3 families have already sent their children away, and we've heard nothing from them since." Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How many people are we talking about?" 47 families in the village proper," Sarah replied. "Perhaps 200 souls in the surrounding farms and steadings. Not a large population by city standards, but these are good people who've worked this land for centuries. They deserve better than to be treated as cattle for the amusement of ancient nobility." "What would help?" Evelyn asked. "If you could have anything, what would make the real difference?" The question sparked a debate that revealed the depth of thought the villagers had already given to their situation. They needed alternative markets for their goods, sources of credit that didn't come with strings attached, and some form of protection that didn't require surrendering their independence. Most of all, they needed hope that their children could build futures in the place their families had called home for generations. As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn found herself sketching plans that drew on every skill she had learned in her years of managing impossible budgets and finding creative solutions to intractable problems. What if the castle could provide a protected market for village goods? What if the clan's alchemical knowledge could be shared to improve crop yields and preserve food through the harsh mountain winters? What if the ancient authority of the Ravencrest name could be used to challenge Lady Cordelia's economic stranglehold? "These are ambitious ideas," Marcus observed as they prepared for the return journey. "But implementing them would require resources the village doesn't have and trust that hasn't been earned." "Then we start small," Evelyn replied. "We prove good faith through actions, not promises." She looked back at the village square, where families were gathering for the evening meal, their faces lit by the warm glow of hearth fires. Every great change begins with a single step taken by someone brave enough to believe in something better. The ride back to the castle passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves on the ancient stone path. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Evelyn felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a cloak made of lead and starlight. The villagers had trusted her with their hopes and fears, sharing secrets that could destroy them if repeated to the wrong ears. That trust was a gift more precious than any jewel, and she knew she would spend whatever remained of her life trying to prove worthy of it. Lord Darius was waiting for them in the castle's courtyard, his dark hair gleaming like polished obsidian in the torchlight. He helped her down from the horse with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his supernatural strength, and she found herself noticing details that had escaped her attention before. The way his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary, the concern that flickered in his eyes as he searched her face for signs of fatigue or distress, the almost imperceptible relaxation of his shoulders when he confirmed she had returned safely. "How did you find our neighbors?" he asked, as Magnus appeared to take charge of their mounts. "Intelligent, proud, and more frightened than they want to admit," Evelyn replied honestly. "They're good people facing an impossible situation, and they deserve better than to be used as pawns in some centuries-old power struggle." "And what do you propose to do about it?" The question hung between them like a challenge and an invitation, loaded with implications that stretched far beyond the immediate crisis. Evelyn realized that this was the moment when she had to choose what kind of person she would become in this strange new world. Would she be a passive victim of circumstances beyond her control, or would she become an active agent of change? "I propose we give them alternatives," she said, "starting with the Harvest Festival. Instead of hiding from Lady Cordelia's visit, we use it as an opportunity to demonstrate a different kind of power. The power of community, of cooperation, of protection that doesn't require submission." Lord Darius studied her with those unreadable dark eyes, and she wondered what he saw when he looked at her. The exhausted seamstress who had fallen asleep on a mountain bus, or something else entirely. "Such a demonstration would require careful planning," he said finally, "and considerable risk. Lady Cordelia does not respond well to challenges to her authority. Then we'd better make sure our challenge is strong enough to succeed," Evelyn replied, "because I've seen what happens to people who live in fear of those who abuse their power, and I refuse to let it happen here." That night, alone in her luxurious chamber, Evelyn stood at the tall windows and looked out over the village lights twinkling in the valley below. Each light represented a family, a story, a hope that deserved protection. The mark on her wrist pulsed with steady rhythm, and for the first time since awakening in this castle, she felt not like a prisoner of ancient laws, but like a guardian of something precious and fragile. The ring on her finger caught the moonlight, its surface inscribed with patterns that seemed to shift and change as she watched. 3 proofs to dissolve the binding, Mrs. Whitmore had said. An ancestral song, a family token, and a public act to reverse humiliation. But as Evelyn contemplated the challenges ahead, she found herself wondering if freedom lay not in breaking the chains that bound her, but in transforming them into something she could choose to wear with pride. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions that could change the fate of everyone in the valley. But tonight, for the first time since her world had been turned upside down, Lady Evelyn Ravencrest felt ready to face whatever came next. The frightened seamstress who had boarded that mountain bus was gone, replaced by someone who had found purpose in the most unlikely of circumstances. The question that remained was whether the man who had orchestrated her binding could become worthy of the choice she was beginning to consider making. Because power without consent was tyranny, but power freely given in service of something greater than oneself was perhaps the most precious gift one soul could offer another. And in the depths of a castle older than memory, where ancient laws still held sway over modern hearts, Evelyn was beginning to understand that the greatest magic of all might be the transformation of necessity into choice, of binding into blessing, of 2 wounded souls finding strength in their shared commitment to protect what mattered most. The transformation began in the 3rd month, when frost painted the mountain peaks silver and the village prepared for the harvest festival that would determine their fate. Evelyn had spent weeks building bridges of trust with careful gestures, her hands learning the rhythm of kneading bread beside Sarah Blackwood, her voice joining the evening prayers that echoed through the village chapel. She understood now that power in this place came not from ancient bloodlines or supernatural abilities, but from the willingness to serve something greater than oneself. She had also been learning the secrets of the elixir that kept the clan's hunger controlled, working alongside Marcus in his family's workshop to create new blends that required less honey and more of the mountain herbs that grew wild and free. Their experiments had yielded promising results, but success would mean nothing if Lady Cordelia succeeded in destroying the village's economic foundation before alternatives could be established. The letter announcing Lady Cordelia's arrival came on a morning when snow dusted the castle battlements like powdered glass. Magnus delivered it with the expression of a man carrying news of a death in the family, the parchment sealed with black wax that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She requests the honor of your hospitality for the 3 nights of the Harvest Festival, Lord Darius read aloud, his voice carefully neutral, along with a retinue of 40 companions and their attendant servants. She expresses particular interest in meeting the new Lady of Ravencrest Castle and observing the autumn traditions of our loyal subjects. Evelyn felt the words like ice water in her veins, but her voice remained steady when she replied, "How many people is that exactly?" "Nearly 100 souls, all of whom must be housed, fed, and entertained according to the ancient laws of hospitality." Mrs. Whitmore's face had gone pale beneath her graying hair. "It will strain our resources to the breaking point, and that's before considering the other requirements of her visit." "The tribute," Evelyn said, the word bitter on her tongue. "Traditionally, she selects 3 young people from the village to join her household," Lord Darius confirmed. "Children with particular talents or beauty who are honored to serve in her eastern territories. They are rarely seen again." The room fell silent except for the whisper of wind through ancient stone, and Evelyn felt the weight of those words settle in her chest like a stone. 3 children, torn from their families to feed the appetites of a creature old enough to remember when the world was young. She thought of the village families she had come to know, of parents who worked their fingers to bone to give their children hope for better futures, and felt something ignite in her soul that had nothing to do with supernatural power and everything to do with human fury. "Not this year," she said quietly. Lord Darius raised an eyebrow with the subtle grace of someone accustomed to choosing his expressions carefully. "I beg your pardon. Not this year," Evelyn repeated, her voice gaining strength with each word. "She will not take children from families under my protection. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, that will not happen." "The ancient laws require—" "The ancient laws," Evelyn interrupted, rising from her chair with the fluid grace she had unconsciously learned from watching the vampires move, "recognize my authority as lady of this castle and protector of this village. If Lady Cordelia wishes to challenge that authority, she's welcome to try." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and danger, broken finally by Mrs. Whitmore's soft voice. "There is a way, my lady. The laws of hospitality work both directions. If you were to offer Lady Cordelia a gift of equal value to what she seeks, tradition would require her to accept it in place of the tribute." "What kind of gift?" "Something precious to you. Something whose loss would cause you genuine pain." The governess met Evelyn's eyes with steady compassion. "The law recognizes only sacrifices that cost the giver something dear." That evening, Evelyn made her way to the castle's archive, a chamber carved deep into the mountain's living rock, where the accumulated wisdom of 7 centuries gathered dust in leather-bound volumes. She had been researching the binding laws that governed her marriage, searching for precedents that might offer hope for transformation rather than dissolution. What she found instead was something far more valuable: the history of her own power. The laws that had bound her to Lord Darius were ancient beyond memory, but they were not immutable. Throughout the centuries, other women had found themselves trapped by circumstance and tradition, and a few had managed to reshape those very laws through clever interpretation and sheer force of will. The key lay in understanding that the binding was not just a chain, but a conduit for power that flowed in both directions. Lady Cordelia Blackthorne arrived on the first night of the Harvest Festival with the pageantry of a conquering army. Her carriage was carved from black wood and pulled by horses that moved with the fluid grace of shadows given form. She herself was a vision from a nightmare dressed as a dream, her ageless beauty preserved by methods that left no trace except in the eyes of her victims. Dark hair cascaded over shoulders draped in midnight silk, and when she smiled, her teeth gleamed like pearls in a skull. "Lady Evelyn," she purred as she stepped from her carriage into the castle's torchlit courtyard. "How delightful to finally meet the mysterious bride who has captured our dear Darius's heart. I confess myself quite curious about the circumstances of your union." Evelyn had dressed for this encounter with the same care a warrior might choose armor, her gown a deep burgundy silk that complemented the silver tracery glowing faintly on her wrist. The raven-crest brooch gleamed on her shoulder, its pomegranate design catching the firelight like a star made manifest. "Lady Cordelia," she replied with a curtsy precise enough to show respect without suggesting submission. "Welcome to Ravencrest Castle. I trust your journey was pleasant." "Enlightening," Cordelia replied, her dark eyes glittering with malice barely concealed beneath courtly politeness. "I had the opportunity to speak with several of your village families along the way. Such charming children they have, so talented." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to having her whims treated as law. But Evelyn had spent months preparing for this moment, and her smile never wavered. "Indeed, the children of Millbrook are remarkable. Which is why I'm so pleased to announce that this year's Harvest Festival will feature a special exhibition of their skills under the patronage of the castle." She gestured toward the Great Hall, where preparations had been underway for weeks. "I do hope you'll honor us with your attendance at tomorrow evening's celebration." Something flickered in Cordelia's perfect features, too quick to interpret, but sharp enough to cut. "How unexpected. I look forward to seeing what entertainments you have planned." The first night passed in formal dinners and polite conversation that crackled with unspoken threats. But it was the second night that would determine the fate of everyone in the valley. The Harvest Festival had been transformed into something unprecedented, a celebration that bridged the gap between castle and village in ways that hadn't been seen for generations. Tables stretched across the castle's great courtyard, laden with foods prepared by village cooks, working alongside the castle's staff. Musicians from Millbrook performed alongside the clan's ancient singers, their modern melodies weaving through songs older than memory. Children ran between the tables with the fearless joy of youth, their laughter echoing off stone walls that had known too little happiness in recent centuries. But it was the exhibition that drew every eye, as young people from the village demonstrated skills that spoke of training far beyond what their humble circumstances should have allowed. Marcus Thornfield presented alchemical innovations that improved upon centuries-old formulas, his hands steady as he mixed compounds that glowed like captured starlight. Sarah Blackwood's daughter Emma wove cloth on a loom that produced patterns complex enough to grace royal courts, while Thomas Millwright's son demonstrated engineering principles that could revolutionize mountain agriculture. "Impressive," Lady Cordelia murmured, her voice carrying the subtle poison of someone whose compliments were more dangerous than curses. One might wonder where such sophisticated education came from in a village so remote. "Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied," Evelyn replied smoothly. "The castle's libraries have been open to any villager with the curiosity to learn, and our scholars have been pleased to discover how much wisdom already existed in the community." It was then that Lady Cordelia made her move, rising from her place at the high table with the fluid grace of a predator preparing to strike. How fascinating, and how generous of you to invest so much effort in temporary residence. The words carried across the courtyard like a blade through silk, sharp enough to cut but subtle enough to leave doubt about the wound. Conversations faltered as guests turned to watch the confrontation that had been building since Cordelia's arrival. "I'm not sure I understand your meaning," Evelyn said carefully. "Oh, but surely you must," Cordelia replied, her smile bright as winter moonlight. "The traditional tribute, of course. 3 young people to join my household, as has been the custom for 20 years. I had my eye on several promising candidates tonight." The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the whisper of wind through the mountain peaks. Evelyn felt every gaze in the courtyard focused on her, waiting to see how the new Lady of Ravencrest Castle would respond to this public challenge. She rose from her own chair with the dignity she had learned from watching Lord Darius navigate impossible situations with grace intact. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Lady Cordelia. The young people of Millbrook are under my protection, and that protection is not negotiable." Cordelia's laugh was like silver bells announcing a funeral. How refreshing to meet someone with such conviction. "But I'm afraid the ancient laws are quite clear on this matter. The tribute has been paid for 20 years, and tradition demands its continuation." "Then allow me to offer an alternative," Evelyn said, her voice carrying across the courtyard with the clarity of a bell. "The laws of hospitality require you to accept a gift of equal value in place of the tribute, do they not?" Something dangerous flickered in Cordelia's ageless eyes. "That depends entirely on what you consider to be of equal value to 3 promising young lives." Evelyn reached for the brooch on her shoulder, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to sacrifice. The pomegranate symbol felt warm beneath her touch, pulsing with the accumulated power of 7 centuries of Ravencrest authority. "This brooch represents my position as lady of this castle, my authority over the village, and my connection to the ancient bloodline that has ruled these territories since before your grandmother's grandmother drew breath." She unclasped the ornament with deliberate care, its silver surface gleaming in the torchlight. "I offer it freely in exchange for the freedom of the children you would claim." The gasp that went up from the assembled guests was audible even over the mountain wind. To surrender the family brooch was to renounce her status, her protection, her very identity as Lady Ravencrest. It was a sacrifice that would leave her powerless against whatever revenge Cordelia might choose to take. But as Evelyn held the brooch out on her open palm, something extraordinary happened. The silver began to glow, not with the cold light of moonlight, but with a warm radiance that spoke of choices made freely rather than circumstances endured. The mark on her wrist responded, its tracery brightening until it was visible even in the torchlight, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she had just fulfilled the second of the 3 ancient proofs. "A family token freely given in trust," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "I believe this satisfies the requirements of the law." Lord Darius was on his feet before the brooch left her palm, his movement so swift it seemed to blur the air around him. But it was his voice that carried the real power, ringing with an authority accumulated over centuries of protecting what he loved. "I invoke the law of public reversal," he declared, his words cutting through the shocked silence like a sword through silk. "Let it be known that it was I who needed protection, not my lady. It was I who orchestrated the binding to shield my people from threats I could not face alone. And it is I who now declares that Lady Evelyn Ravencrest chose this burden freely, transforming necessity into gift." The mark on Evelyn's wrist flared brilliant as summer lightning, and she felt something shift in the very foundations of reality. The binding that had trapped her was dissolving, but instead of breaking apart, it was reforming into something new, something chosen rather than imposed. Lady Cordelia snatched the brooch from Evelyn's palm with movements too quick for mortal eyes to follow, but her triumph lasted only until she tried to clasp it to her own shoulder. The silver burned her fingers like living flame, and she dropped it with a curse that turned the very air around her acrid with malice. "The brooch recognizes only those who serve rather than take," Mrs. Whitmore said quietly, stepping forward to retrieve the fallen ornament. "Lady Evelyn has earned the right to wear it through her actions, not her circumstances." As the governess fastened the brooch back onto Evelyn's shoulder, the assembled crowd began to murmur with growing excitement. The laws had been observed, the challenge met, and the tribute refused through means none of them had imagined possible. But it was Marcus Thornfield who provided the final perfect note to the evening's transformation. "I have prepared a special elixir in honor of our guests," he announced, carrying forward a crystal decanter filled with liquid that shimmered like captured moonlight. "Made from the finest mountain herbs and the first honey of the season, aged in caves where the ancient songs still echo." As he poured the elixir into goblets offered to each guest, Evelyn caught the subtle scent that marked this as no ordinary brew. This was the new formula they had perfected together, the one that required no tribute of fear, no payment in servitude, only the free cooperation of people working toward common goals. Lady Cordelia accepted her goblet with the expression of someone who had just discovered that the prey she thought cornered was actually the hunter. She raised it in a toast that carried all the venom she could no longer express directly. "To unexpected transformations," she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard with the chill of winter frost, "and to the discovery that even the oldest laws can be reinterpreted." She drank deeply, and for a moment her ageless features softened with something that might have been relief. The elixir worked on vampires of all bloodlines, easing the constant hunger that drove them to seek dominance over lesser beings. For the first time in centuries, Lady Cordelia tasted satisfaction that came not from conquest, but from simple sustenance freely offered. "Perhaps," she said finally, setting down her empty goblet with the careful precision of someone reassessing everything they thought they knew, "it is time for me to reconsider certain traditions." The harvest festival continued until dawn, painted the mountain peaks rose and gold, but the real celebration was only beginning. As Lady Cordelia departed with her retinue, her farewell carried grudging respect rather than threats. Evelyn felt the final transformation taking place in her own heart. The mark on her wrist had settled into her skin like a tattoo made of starlight. No longer a chain, but a reminder of choices made freely in service of something greater than herself. The ring on her finger had grown warm, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat rather than fighting against it. And when Lord Darius took her hand as they watched the sunrise from the castle's highest tower, she felt the completion of a journey that had begun with terror and ended with something far more precious than freedom. "No regrets?" he asked softly, his dark eyes reflecting the dawn light with warmth she had never seen before. "Only one," she replied, turning to face the man who had become her partner in truth, rather than mere legal fiction. "I regret that it took me so long to understand what I was really choosing." His kiss tasted of mountain air and promise, of ancient magic transformed by modern love, of two souls who had found strength in their shared commitment to protect what mattered most. And as the village below began to stir with the sounds of a new day beginning, Lady Evelyn Ravencrest knew that the greatest magic of all was the alchemy that transformed two wounded hearts into something strong enough to shelter others. The castle had found its true lady at last, not through ancient laws or supernatural bonds, but through the simple recognition that power shared was power multiplied, that love freely given was worth more than submission forcibly taken, and that sometimes the most profound transformations began with nothing more than the courage to fall asleep in the right place at exactly the right time. In the archives of Ravencrest Castle, scribes would record that on this day, the ancient laws were fulfilled and transformed, creating new precedents for future generations. But in the village of Millbrook, where children played freely in streets no longer shadowed by fear, they would remember it as the day their lady chose to be exactly what they needed her to be. And high in the mountain castle, where vampires and humans lived in harmony, where ancient magic served modern love, where two souls had found their perfect match in the most impossible of circumstances, the story continued with the promise that the best adventures were yet to come.